If you're attending for the first time this evening, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Maui Nui Marine Resource Council, or MNMRC. We are a nonprofit organization dedicated to clean ocean water, healthy coral reefs, and abundant native fishes. We are currently working to put oysters, caged oysters, in Maʻalaea Harbor. And like our graduate students just mentioned, the water quality in the harbor is pretty bad. A lot of runoff is going in there and it gets kind of stuck because it's just that enclosed space. And so oysters are filter feeders and they are amazingly good at cleaning water. One adult oyster can filter about 40 gallons a day, and they remove things like sediment, which is really important for corals because sediment makes the water column kind of dark and it blocks sunlight. They also can remove bacteria, they can remove heavy metals, pesticides and herbicides. So we're hoping that putting them in the harbor will really help clean the water. We are currently working with the Waterkeeper Alliance to get permits to put them in there. So we're hoping maybe by the end of this year we'll actually have oysters in there doing some hard work and cleaning up some of the water in the harbor. And one of the reasons that we host these meetings, of course, is it gives us an opportunity to hear from experts and to learn about their work they're doing around Maui and Hawaii. It gives us an opportunity to talk about some of the conservation challenges that we're facing and also the solutions to some of these challenges. And tonight's speaker is dealing with one of our biggest challenges. He's trying to figure out how we can help save our coral reefs. Our coral reefs are hugely important ecosystems. Even though they only cover about 1% of the ocean environment, 25% of marine life depends on them. And they're also important to us. They protect our shorelines, they protect us from waves and from storms. They provide us with food, and they're also important to our economy. We have lots of visitors here because of our coral reefs. And so, Dr. Dave Gulko he's currently working to make sure that our reefs are hopefully going to be here in the future, right? He's a biologist with the Department of Land and Natural Resources, and he is a director of the Division of Aquatic Resources Coral Restoration Nursery. Right now, his work is focused on growing massive corals, which are more resistant to the changing temperatures that we're seeing than some of the smaller branching coral varieties. So now I'm going to turn the mic over to Dr. Gulko so he can talk to you about his work.
Okay, usually when I have to do talks to groups, I have to go into what a coral is and all that kind of stuff. And luckily, I think with this crowd, I don't. So we can talk about some of the more interesting things we're doing and some of the problems we're facing and how we're hoping to address some of those problems. So about 10 years ago in Hawaii, we had a series of very large vessel groundings on Oahu. Amongst the largest vessel groundings in U.S. history on coral reefs. And as all good government agencies do, we went out and we investigated them and we tried to hold the responsible parties accountable. In some cases we were successful, in others we weren't. In the cases where we were successful, we recovered a decent amount of money, not a lot. And I was hoping that those funds would go to restore the coral reefs that were damaged by those groundings. And being the naive young coral reef biologist I was, it turns out very little of that money, in fact none of it really went to restore what was damaged. And I was frustrated by that. And I decided that one of the things we needed to do was come up with mechanisms that we could actively restore damaged areas. And at the time I was thinking it was primarily due to guys in boats hitting reefs and us going and fixing them. And that's how this all started. And as I started working on it and getting more people involved with it through the department and hiring people to work with us, I became very aware that the way that they grow coral everywhere in the world wouldn't work here. The way that coral restoration occurs in most places is people they get small fragments of coral, they either place them on tables in the ocean or they hang them from lines in the ocean, and they grow them and then they go and attach them wherever they want. It's cheap, it's easy, it's fast. It seems like it would be a great way of doing it. And that works if you have corals that grow 15, 20, 25 centimeters a year, which is what the growth rate is of corals in most parts of the world, except here in Hawaii, where it grows 1 to 2 centimeters a year on average. So we needed a different way of doing it. So we looked around and we came up with what I'm about to show you. But I want you to recognize that we have a lot of things that are really unique here in Hawaii, and I'll talk about some of them. One of them is we're one of, in fact, now with Maui Ocean Center, there are exactly 4 land-based nurseries in the United States, and 2 of them are now in Hawaii. And so that makes us very unique. And what we're doing is very different than what everybody else is doing. So let's talk about it. So when I first started working on coral reefs for DLNR, for the Department of Land and Natural Resources, coral reef conservation was pretty cut and dry. I mean, you go out, you monitor. Actually, that's what we still do. Most of our time is spent monitoring. We monitor the state of reefs. We monitor the number of fish. We monitor the number of users or the number of anchor strikes. We monitor. And then we started looking at other things: aquatic invasive species, enhancing enforcement, marine debris, bleaching events. You guys know all this. This is probably stuff you deal with every day. And the model for how to do this is Australia. The Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority is looked at as the top. I mean, that's Moses coming down from the mountain with the commandments. How you monitor, how you deal with land-based sources of pollution, how you deal with ecotourism, how you deal with community-based management, how you deal with sustainable use, all came out of GBRMPA, out of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. Because everybody looked at that as, wow, look how well they manage it. And it's well funded. Every time you fly over the barrier reef on a tour or on a boat or go out to one of the hotels out there, you pay a reef tax, and that all goes to support it. So they're better funded than anybody else who does this kind of stuff. And then a funny thing happened. In 2016, they had a bleaching event. And by the way, that's the same bleaching event that we had here in 2015. It's just because they're south of the equator, it was a little later. And just like what happened here, about 50% of their corals died. Now, when that happened in 2015 here, what did we do about it? What did Hawaii do about it? Does anybody know? We had a major coral die-off here in 2015. No, we didn't do it. We did something. We monitored, because that's what we always do. So we went out and watched things die and measured how many of them died. And with the hope of measuring how many of them come back. But at 1 to 2 centimeters a year, you know, it's slow. That's what we did, because that's what we always have done up to now, and that's what we were taught to do. The Australians did something very different, because they got the crap scared out of them, basically. They had this huge economic engine for Northern Australia came grinding to a halt. And basically, this is what happened. So very, very large, hundreds of years old coral heads bleached, and a couple months later, they were dead. And this happened across thousands of miles in Northern Australia. And what the Australians did is they started realizing, okay, this happened for the first major time there in 2016, and it's bad, it's really bad, but what happens if it starts happening more than that one time? They were going to see huge impacts on their economy. And so they tried to figure out what those impacts would be, and they did it very differently than we do it. First thing they did is they looked at the global climate change models. I'm sorry, these are the global climate change models, looking at what happens if there's a, these are different models relating to how many degrees in temperature it's likely to change. This is the most conservative model thought, and we're well past that, by the way. So we're going to see much greater changes than what that model's projecting. But basically, you see with this model, your good reefs, in other words, your reefs with really high coral cover and biodiversity, are going to decline relatively high in a period of about 50 years. And with the higher degree change in temperature, you see that happens a lot sooner. So what the Australians did is they projected this out, these different models, and they realized that basically they had this one little period of time in here to do something. Because once you get past about 2050, it's game over. Right? And by the way, this is well published. This isn't just for Australia, this is globally. So the same thing here. In fact, it's probably much earlier for us because of some other things I'm going to talk about. And this means they have a very little, narrow, about 20-year window of opportunity to do something. So they started off with that. We got about 20 years. If we're going to do something, we have about 20 years to do it. And then what they did is they started looking at what are the effects. Well, it's easy to measure the effects on tourism and other things, but they went bigger than that. And what they did, and this kind of walks you through it, but basically they looked at, given climate change, given that we know sea levels are going to rise, given that we know that with increased heat there's going to be stronger changes in weather and storms are going to be much stronger, and we expect to have higher storm frequency. When you combine all that together, you realize that normally what used to be a beach out here, you're going to see wave events and rough water events coming into about here. But then they did something else based upon having lost 50% of the coral. Because those models were developed, just like the one here in Hawaii, by the way, for looking at how far increased water is going to come into shore, were based on the assumption that the reefs are still there. But if you lose your coral, especially in a place like Hawaii where we have very high wave action different parts of the year, that abrasion that's going to occur on the reefs, you're going to lose reef. And so they modeled what happens if we lose 1 meter, this much, of our reef. In other words, if the reef was here and it comes down to here because of those corals dying, what happens? And they realized now your water comes all the way into here. You're well within the area of developed shoreline. And now instead of dealing in terms of hundreds of millions of dollars in loss to affect your economy, now you're in billions of dollars. In actual, for the case of Australia, it's about 74 billion a year based on infrastructure damage. Now think of Wailea, think of Lahaina, think of Ka'anapali, think of Waikiki. Think of the value of the infrastructure within that very short distance, where if we don't have reefs, you're going to have water coming in much farther into shore. And now you have a reason to do something. Honestly, most politicians, they'll pay lip service to the idea of losing biodiversity or having some effect on tourism or whatever. But you start talking about billions and billions and billions of dollars. Just think of our sewage systems. Think of our power plants. Are all located right next to shore. Think about roadways. Think of all these different infrastructure effects are going to be amplified just because of losing 1 meter of reef. Just because our corals are dying. So they took this and this is just talking about Hawaii. They went and then they actually took that distance, and now they could show what happens with 1 meter reef loss, and you can see the actual effect on infrastructure in billions. And by the way, this is just for northern Australia, just the Great Barrier Reef. This isn't for all of Australia. So you can extrapolate that out even farther. And then what they did is, okay, so we have to do something. What do we do? And the term they use is interventions. What can we do to intervene in this situation where we're going to lose reefs and we're going to see all this damage? And so they started looking at what are the possible things they could do either to the Great Barrier Reef or to the waters surrounding the Great Barrier Reef or to shores or to the weather on the Great Barrier Reef to make changes. And they came up with a bunch of strategies. And then what the Australians do that we don't really do well here in the US is they did risk assessments. So they look at what is the risk of something positive happening if we do this intervention versus what is the risk of a negative thing happening if we do this intervention. And when you plot that out, you see that certain things, by the way, these are the things they were already doing, really help out. So you got to do more of it. And other things that they might try out have a good chance of helping, but they have to develop those because the technologies aren't there yet. And some things that seem like it might do well actually could pose a pretty big risk. Now, if we apply this to Hawaii, take that same approach, but now we do it for Hawaii, some things are different. And why are they different? Well, they're different because unlike Australia, where you have only 1% endemism on your reef, we have on average 25% endemism, meaning 25% of the species are found nowhere else on the planet except here in Hawaii, and in some cases only on certain reefs. All right, that means we have no insurance pool. We have nowhere to go if something bad happens. All right, in addition, as I said, our corals grow extremely slow, which means any mistake you make is going to be amplified greatly across the area that you make it. So you've got to be even more careful, more conservative. Third, there's two types of corals in the world. All right, there are what are called perforate corals and imperforate corals. An imperforate coral is one where the coral only grows on the outside of the skeleton. They tend to grow really, really fast, and they tend to be rather sensitive to environmental perturbation. The other type of coral is called a perforate coral. It means it's perforated. The tissue goes way down into the skeleton. So it may not look like it's doing too well on the surface, but there's tissue deep in the skeleton that can reemerge if something bad happens. We tend to have a lot of perforate corals here in Hawaii. Now, perforate corals are characterized by being really slow growers. All right. And finally, COT stands for crown of thorns sea stars. All right. Everywhere in the world they worry about, well, not everywhere because they don't have them in the Caribbean. Everywhere in the Pacific they worry about crown of thorns sea stars, right? And what do you do if you see crown of thorns? Oh, it's really bad. You got to take it out of the water. You got to kill it, right? Because that's what they do in Australia, that's what they do in Fiji, that's what they do in Guam. The reason is the primary food of crown of thorns sea stars are these imperforate corals. In Hawaii, we don't have a lot of imperforate corals. So we tend to not have a lot of problems with crown of thorns. So therefore, crown of thorns control is not really a good strategy for us if we're trying to minimize the effects of climate change. In Australia, it is a good strategy because if that's one of the major impacts on their fast-growing corals, if they can control that, they can help minimize those other effects. And finally, we're an island, and there's certain well-known characteristics about island environments that make us different than large continental-based areas like Australia in terms of things like runoff and how water moves around the island, etc. So when you add all these things in, you can see that certain things moved around. Interestingly, a lot of the things that worked the best for Australia also would work the best for Hawaii. They also happen to be the things that we're really not that good at doing. Zoning, fisheries management, etc. But if we could get better, and there's no reason we can't, because it's just political will. If we can get better at these things, we could make a big dent in the effects of climate change in our nearshore waters. Other things that we're doing, recruitment enhancement is stuff like our coral nursery, and I'll talk more about that in a second. Some of these other interventions I'm going to also show you because they hold a lot of unique potential for changing on small scales the effects of climate in our nearshore waters. But just like the Australians are discovering, looking for supercorals is probably not the best idea for us right now. You may have heard of this concept of supercorals, the idea of making really climate-resistant corals. All right? You may have heard of that with plants, making really climate-resistant plants. What do we call really climate-resistant plants? We call them weeds. Okay? And if it's an insect, what's a really climate-resistant insect? A cockroach. All right? And they are. But it's not probably the best thing. And why? Because, as I said, 25% of our corals are endemic. They arose because of the lack of supercorals. They arose because of the lack of generalist corals that could do really well in all conditions. And when you put something like that into an environment that has 25% unique things, you very quickly lose those 25% unique things. And that's not the only problem. Because 25% of our corals are endemic, we've had a wide range of other organisms that have evolved to live on, in, and around those unique corals. We have butterfly fish here that will only feed on certain species of endemic corals. If those endemic corals go, what do you think is going to happen to those unique butterfly fish? And on and on and on. So it's a much bigger snowball effect than just losing a couple coral species. Now, we were talking about this before the talk tonight. There may be a time when we want a supercoral because we've lost everything. All right, there is a time when you are willing to have crabgrass as your lawn. because nothing else will grow. But until that time, we spend a lot of our time getting rid of crabgrass, don't we? And here in Hawaii, we may want to develop a supercoral, but we don't want it anywhere near the ocean. In fact, if it was up to me, I would have the people who want to work on supercorals move to Colorado. So there's no chance of it going out through an outfall. There's no chance of it getting in our ocean. I want them doing it. Don't get me wrong. But I want them doing it and keeping it in an aquarium in Colorado until we need it, because it's such a risk to what we have here. That's not to say it's not good research. It's great research. It's not to say it's not necessary. It is necessary. But you have to measure that against the risk it poses to our natural environments here. And there are other interventions that we could be trying to do that would have a bigger ecosystem effect than just creating a supercoral. Oops. So here's Hawaii. Or here's Hawaii. And traditionally, the way we've dealt with management of our resources, these are the traditional responses we've done to managing coral reef resources. And primarily, in fact, almost entirely, they've been focused on one of two things at the local level. Planned impacts, which are people who want to develop things or dredge harbors or create channels or build hotels along the coastline or golf courses. And unplanned impacts. These are people who do things they shouldn't do either accidentally or on purpose. And so our management regimes have evolved to directly address those two aspects. But over the last 10 to 20 years, we started to realize that this big world out there is having an effect on Hawaii. And our management regimes, these traditional responses, cannot deal with the regional impacts and especially with the global impacts. Now, for the planned stuff, in the last 10 years, we've come up with some pretty cool things at DAR, and we're applying it, and they are working. We've come up with a way of determining what the lost services and functions are of any impacted coral. We can use this to hold responsible parties accountable, or in the case of a developer, to make them mitigate the causes or the costs of the damages they cause. We've developed the Coral Reef Mitigation Bank, a way for responsible parties to buy credits against the damages they cause. So we've created mechanisms to try to get people who are causing damage to make account for that damage to help restore the resources. We developed our Coral Reef Restoration Nursery, which I'll show you shortly, which we're using to fast grow corals to have something to restore. And we've really beefed up our ability to do in-water investigations to hold people accountable. Do you guys remember a number of years ago, a tour boat out at Molokini sank a couple times? That was one of the examples where we use these techniques to go and, in a legally defensible manner, a way that would hold up in court, measure the damage, literally collect evidence, legal evidence that we could use to encourage the responsible party to be accountable for the damages they caused. All of these created a direct line of defense against these local impacts. But now we need other things. So one of the things that we've done recently is we've created a coral ark. Not just us, the Maui Ocean Center has also. And we actually have an arrangement with the Maui Ocean Center where DAR shares our material, they share their material being rare corals. And we can compare, because they have full-time aquarists, we have full-time aquarists, we can compare our different techniques that we're using for keeping them alive and different ways that we're growing them. And it also gives us a little bit of an insurance policy. If something happens to our coral nursery or something happens to the Maui Ocean Center, the other place has the same unique resources. These other things we haven't done yet, but this is the secondary line of defense to help us. These are the interventions to help us with these global impacts that we're facing now. This is just showing you the mitigation bank process we have. Real quickly, the idea is we can grow corals at the coral nursery, go out, restore an area. The restoration can be measured using the ecological characterization tool, and a number of credits can be assigned for the amount of restoration that occurred. That tells us how many credits we can sell. At the same time or a later time, a responsible party, either through a planned impact or an unplanned impact, we can do an in-water investigation, determine what was damaged. We can use the tool to determine what the lost services and functions were and assign credits. In other words, how many credits does the responsible party need to buy to offset the damage they caused? And at that point now it's just a a transaction. The state sells the credits to the responsible party. That money is then pushed back in to restore more reefs. That's how a mitigation bank works. And Hawaii has developed the first coral reef mitigation bank in the country. Kind of what this means in a little bit bigger picture is before you'd have an impact to a reef. Here's a reef, a normal stage of a reef, a baseline before an impact. An impact occurs and you get a loss of resources, a loss of services and functions. Think of a ship hitting a reef, right? And as long as that ship is there, it won't recover. You remove the ship and slowly over time, the reef will recover back to baseline. Now, traditionally, when we would go in and measure damages, we would just go in and quickly measure coral cover. Well, if you measure, we would measure the amount of corals. If you measure the amount of corals damaged, that's just that. All of this is lost. You're not recovering that from the responsible party because you're not measuring the lost services and functions over time that it takes for it to recover. And if you just use coral cover as your metric, which is how most coral reef monitoring is done, all you're doing is measuring this. So you're losing most of the services and functions that occurred on that reef that was damaged. It's taken us decades, but we've learned from that. Now we actually go out and measure in a way that we can measure the lost services and functions and try to restore to that. So it's not about just putting out coral. I can put out coral. Quick example. This fine young man tonight goes next door, drinks, gets in his car, drives into a park and trashes a bunch of the park. Breaks down, drives over the grass, drives over the bushes, drives over the trees. Gets arrested for drunk driving, goes to court. The county here sues him because there's a cost to damaging that park and they don't want to recoup it. His lawyer comes in and says, Your Honor, yes, I understand my client caused these damages. We're really sorry. We're going to make full amends. Okay, our scientists have gone out. We've determined the plant cover that was damaged, and we're going to replace. In fact, it was only 90% plant cover in that park before my client did it. We're gonna bump it up to 100 because that's how good a guy he is. So what does he do? He goes down to the local plant store, buys a little packet of grass seeds for 99 cents, spreads the grass seeds, and a couple months later you got 100% cover of grass, and he's replaced all the plant cover. That's the problem with measuring coral cover. It's a very bad metric because what are you losing? You're losing those big trees. And the big trees provide what? They provide shade, windbreaks, places for birds and insects and other plants to live. All right? And that's what we get when we go out and measure corals. If we're not measuring the form of the coral and the size of the coral, we lose all that. And that's what we're trying to get around by moving away from coral cover to actually measuring the corals, to try to recover the majority of those lost services and functions. So, other places in the world, when they restore corals, this is what they do. They create these coral trees or hanging nurseries, and you notice what's on all of these. It's branching corals because they grow fast. All right. The other problem with growing things on trees or on lines like that is the growth is in response to gravity. So you tend to get elongations, which is fine if it's fast growing, but here in Hawaii where things are slow growing, if I get really narrow elongations in my coral growth and I go plant that onto a reef with any wave action, it's going to fall apart very quickly. So this type of method has not worked here for the most part. And once again, because of that really slow growth rate of 1 to 2 centimeters a year, it's probably not the best method for us, are these hanging nurseries or line nurseries. Instead, we recognize that the vast majority of our corals in Hawaii are these perforate corals. Think of massive corals, finger corals, etc. And we know that tissue, you can see it here, goes way down into the skeleton. Okay, they grow slow. They have some different effects. And as such, instead of putting out thousands of little tiny fragments, which is what they do in most places, because it grows fast and because they're branching corals, because most of our corals are either encrusting or massive, what we're moving towards is putting out really big corals and gaining what's called a size effect. Okay? Every plant and animal has what's called a size effect. It's the size at which the organism goes from putting all of its available energy into growth into taking some of that energy and putting it into other things. For a human, it's about 12, 13 years old. For a dog, it's about 6 to 8 months, depending upon the breed. It's the point at which you become sexually mature. And you're sexually mature because natural selection has determined that at some point for your species, you reach a size where you are most capable of surviving well on your own, and therefore you can take some of that energy that you were previously putting into growth to get as big as you could, as quickly as you could, into reproduction. Now for corals, for many corals, not all, but for many corals, that size is around 20, 25 centimeters. We've chosen, because of the massive corals, because of our wave energy here in Hawaii and a lot of our exposed reefs, we're trying to grow many of our species for outplanting. We're shooting for around 40 to 42 centimeters for many of the ones that we're putting out. Trying to get well past that size refuge and get to a big enough shape where the coral is very likely to survive, but there's something else. The bigger you are, just remember I was talking about the difference between grass and trees, the bigger you are, the more ecological services and functions you provide to the ecosystem. So the bigger corals we can put out, the more benefit the reef gains. So we want to be putting out big corals, not only because they have a better chance of survival, but because they provide for more things on the reef to do well. Now, the Australians went and looked at how reefs are doing, and especially how reef transplantation methods, how successful they've been. And you can see it's all over the map here. All right, some have been very successful, in other words, as measured by percentage survival, and some have been very successful but cost a lot, and some have been very successful and been very cheap, and likewise, some have cost a lot and not done well, and some have been very cheap and not done so well. So it's all over the place. This doesn't include Hawaii. If we take what we've done in the short time we've been open at the Coral Restoration Nursery and we plot it, we find that we are amongst the most expensive, and you understand that, it's Hawaii, right? But we also have amongst the highest survival. We've had 100% survival of the corals we put out. Part of that's due to the size. Part of that's due to the fact that when we put things out, they're 100% covered with live tissue, which gives them a big bump up. And part of that probably is dumb luck. I mean, to be honest, I mean, this is not a perfect. This is not a well-known field yet. It's very young. But the fact that so many of our corals we put out have done really well, and I'll show you that in a second, makes me think we're along the right track, at least for now. So how are we doing that? We're doing it through something called microfragmentation. Like I said, it's not just us. The Maui Ocean Center has started doing this. They've started up their own coral restoration nursery using the same techniques that we're doing, and we're in constant communication with each other. And I'm very positive about this partnership. I think it's going to do really well for Maui County, and it provides the state with a secondary mechanism for trying to restore reefs. Microfragmentation is basically using this cool little saw to precisely cut corals into very small pieces. When you go really small, what happens is you can grow in more directions at the same growth rate you would normally. And if I cut a bunch of pieces from one coral, and each of these is growing in all directions, by definition you're going to grow a lot faster, because at some point you're going to merge together in a fraction of the time it would take if I just had one of those pieces growing. Secondly, you trigger what's called a stress response. You see this with plants. When you take a cutting, it grows faster from the cut end, right? Same thing with corals. You'll get a stress response along those lines. And then, because the corals are genetically identical, they'll fuse, and you can see them starting to fuse here. We can cover a large area with a very small amount of coral this way. So we're able to, I gotta put this down. We're able to start off with about 10 centimeters of coral tissue, source material. And from that 10 centimeters, we can produce a 42 centimeter module in about 8 months. Now, because of our protocols, when we collect a coral, it goes into quarantine for a minimum of 1 month, and while it's in our growing area, it's kind of like staying at the Four Seasons. All right? It's like you have room service every day. You've got, maids cleaning up after you. It's a nice, clean environment. You got great food. It's like being in a 5-star hotel. And to put it back in the ocean, I got to get it used to being homeless again. So what we do is we acclimate the corals to going into crappy conditions. And that takes about a month. So you got a month on the front end, a month on the back end, and in case a tank goes down or we lose a pump or something, we add in another 2 months. So we estimate we can go from 10 centimeters to 42 centimeters in 1 year. In fact, we don't estimate it, we are doing that. And that gives us lots of safety for any problems. In the wild, in Hawaii, for a Perites coral, a massive coral, to go from 10 centimeters to 42 centimeters takes 20 to 25 years. That's what we're gaining right now with this method. And this is what it looks like. So this coral started off as 10 centimeters. This is a 42 centimeter module. You can see it's pretty much 100% covered except at the very top. And you can see this has not been out that long, but you can start to see a little bit of accretion, because once I put it back in the wild, it goes back to growing only 1 to 2 centimeters a year versus that 4 to 10 centimeters a year it was growing in the nursery. But you can see it's very, very healthy. Okay, here's a coral we outplanted 1 month after outplanting, and here it is 9 months later, and it looks even healthier than it did when we outplanted it. That's a Perites. Here's a Montipora, same thing. 1 month after outplanting, 18 months, so a year and a half later, and look at the accretion. And you can see it's grown up. And these large sizes, you notice we plant, our shapes are kind of pyramid shaped. We picked that shape because that's the best shape for sloughing sediment that might be in the water and with resisting the wave action that we have coming in normally on most of our reefs. So that pyramid module is our standard now. Oh. Okay. Now, there's a problem in Hawaii. If I take a coral from Maʻalaea, take it in, using the Maui Ocean Center to grow it, and I want to put it out at Olowalu, all right, I might go and collect 10 centimeters of coral from Maʻalaea and put out a 42 centimeter coral in Olowalu. No problem, right? What if I got to do 100 corals? Well, now that's 100 times 10 centimeters from Maʻalaea. I'm going to have a big gain at Olowalu, but I'm having an impact at Maʻalaea. And that's the problem we have here in Hawaii, is where do we get coral from because of those impacts? Because of that slow growth rate, because of that high endemism. So in a lot of places in the world, they don't care about that. They just go break off some coral, string it up, grow it, and go put it out. We don't have that luxury here in Hawaii. And at DLNR, we can't do that. We have a responsibility, we have a public trust responsibility that we minimize our impact on the reefs in order to restore other reefs. So the way that we've gotten around that is, Hawaii's an interesting place. I mean, you've got, on Oahu, where I'm from, 1.2 million people living within 3 miles of a pretty robust coral reef. You don't see that anywhere else on Earth. And we have harbors, and harbors have a lot of coral in them. Maʻalaea Harbor has a lot of coral in it. Corals in harbors do not provide the same services and functions that corals on the reef do. In other words, the same exact coral growing in a harbor, same size, same species, same form, in the harbor versus on the reef. On the reef, it's providing protection against waves. It's forming sand. It's providing shelter space for a wide variety of organisms. In the harbor, that's not occurring to that extent. So we value corals in harbors lower than we do corals on reefs. And if we remove them from the harbor, especially if they're from man-made structures in the harbor, we're not having any effect on a reef. So that's one source we have in the harbor, is corals from a harbor. Now, some coral species I can't find in harbors. They don't occur there. And those may be the corals we have to restore. If we do remove a coral from Maʻalaea, instead of collecting 10 centimeters, we'll collect 20 centimeters. We'll take that 20 centimeters, divide it into two parts. 10 centimeters we grow into one 42 centimeter pyramid. The other 10 we grow into a second 42 centimeter pyramid. The first 42 centimeter pyramid I take out to Oluwalu. The second one I go put back in Maʻalaea. And now I've gone in 1 year from 20 centimeters of coral loss to 42 centimeters of coral gain. I've doubled the size of the coral. That saves 10 years off what it would have taken in the wild. So there's still a benefit. So those are the two strategies we use at the Coral Restoration Nursery for sourcing corals. When we bring the corals in, we use this called an aquasaw. You can see we can make very precise cuts. It has these advantages. We're increasing the surface area to volume ratio. We're minimizing. By cutting these corals, remember, if we're collecting a coral in the harbor, great source of coral, lousy place to collect it from because harbors tend to be polluted. Harbors tend to be where you have heavy metals. Harbors in Hawaii tend to be where we have most of our aquatic invasive species. And all of these things pose a risk to our natural reefs. So not only do they go through quarantine, but when we microfrag them, all we use is the outermost tissue area. We cut away all that internal skeleton and we cut away the non-coral parts, and that minimizes the risks from pollution, heavy metals, AIS, etc., aquatic invasive species, etc. We then take those tiny little fragments that are genetically identical to each other and we glue them onto a concrete module. These concrete modules have been soaking in water for over a month to leach out any chemicals that might be in the concrete itself. So we're very confident that we're not introducing chemicals into the environment. And we attach them with super glue, but not just any super glue. Actually, you could use any super glue. But because, once again, being government and concerns about the public saying, oh, you're harming the corals with super glue, we use human surgical super glue, which is basically super glue, but if you call it medical grade, you can charge 3 times the amount. But by using that, that should eliminate, I mean, if it's good enough to use inside your body, gluing together parts of you, it really probably isn't hurting the coral. And by the way, we don't observe any tissue loss using this, so I'm very confident it's not harming the coral. We use that to attach these, and the spacing is very important with this. And then from there, it goes into our Four Seasons Hotel. These are very specialized tanks. If you ever get a chance to see the ones they have at the Maui Ocean Center, you'll see something very similar. We have a system where basically we're scrubbing the water, we're adding certain minerals to the water, kind of like having an IV in you. We're feeding them, we make our own foods, specialized foods that we're feeding them to increase their growth rate. These lights are very unique lights, they're LED lights, they're programmable. We can mimic sunrise, noon, cloud cover, lightning, sunset, every single moon phase you can think of, including eclipses. We can even do disco lights if we wanted to. And these light regimes are very important not only for helping the coral grow, but we can simulate depth with the lights that we use, so we can simulate the depths they're going to be transplanted into. We can also get them into a normal lunar cycle so that when they go out, they'll be better prepared for reproduction. And you can see the results. That's a Montipora, 100% covered, getting ready to go out to our acclimation tanks to get acclimated for outplanting onto the reef. Here's a Porites that we've outplanted. And when we outplant, we use a 2-part epoxy that actually Maui Ocean Center taught us about, called Splash, that they've used here, and they've had those corals reproduce. So I feel very confident that the epoxies we're using, unlike many marine epoxies, pretty confident these epoxies aren't having a long-term effect on the corals. And here you can see, let's see, there's 1, 2, there should be another one over here, 3, 4 of our modules, different species all out in the field. Once again, you can see coral accretion on this Montipora in a rather crappy reef environment, by the way. Now, that's 42 centimeters. By the way, 42 centimeters is bigger than anybody else has done anywhere in the world up till now. But given Hawaii, given our wave action, given how slow things grow, we need to go bigger. So this year, we're now shooting for a little bit bigger than 42 centimeters. The problem is when I go bigger than 42 centimeters, 42 centimeters is like that, we want to go for a meter. Problem is that gets heavy. That's a lot of concrete. That's a problem. Moving it around, there's safety issues with having divers moving things like that in the water. So we can't use the mech the way we're doing it now. We had to come up with a new way of doing it. So the way we're thinking of is instead of a single module that's 42 centimeters that we grow coral on, we're going to grow 4 pyramids. They'll be like triangular pyramid pieces that we'll cover, and then we'll put them together. So it'll look, you'll have 4 of these pieces that will grow out, and then underwater we'll put them together, and now all that has to happen is this line here has to fuse. And at 1 to 2 centimeters a year, that line will fuse in about a week and a half. What it would look like in the field is like this. It'll come together. After about a week, those lines, the line you see there will disappear. It'll fuse, and we'll have a single 1 meter colony. Now, to go from 20 centimeters of source material to 1 meter in the wild would take 100 to 150 years in Hawaii. And we're doing it in 1 year and putting out big corals. But we do other things there. A couple of years ago, we realized with the bleaching event, we had advance notice that the bleaching event was going to occur here. We kind of shut down the nursery, took the staff, working with the Maui Ocean Center, we went around and collected as many of the rare Hawaiian species as we could. In fact, the Maui Ocean Center was so good at it, not only did we get a lot of the known rare species, they found 2 new species of native Hawaiian corals that nobody knew about before. All right, and what we did in both facilities is we created an ark. And that ark has been very successful. We're maintaining these corals. We're not trying to grow them fast. We're just trying to keep them alive and very healthy. But they've done so well. This is a type of coral called Parietes duodenii, primarily known from Kaneohe Bay. We went out prior to that bleaching event in 2015 and collected 3 small pieces that we then fragged and put into our system. We collected it from 3 colonies. After the event, we went back to Kaneohe Bay to see how they were doing. All 3 colonies were dead. In fact, we couldn't find Parietes duodenii in Kaneohe Bay after that event. Now, Parietes duodenii is endemic to Hawaii. It was known from Molowalu, by the way. But I haven't seen any reports of it since that event anywhere. However, that's Parietes duodenii. This is Montipora dilatata, also known from just Kaneohe Bay primarily. It's a couple other places. These are 2 modules of Parietes duodenii that we've grown out. They did so well in our ark, we were able to refrag those small pieces and use those small fragments to grow a couple small pyramids. In a couple months, our plan is to reintroduce this coral back into Kaneohe Bay. It will be the first reintroduction of an extirpated coral species anywhere in the world. And this is the strength of having arks, of having an ark system. Think of it like a seed bank. To push this reasoning a little bit more forward, why do we have to bring things out on land? Why do we got to keep them on land? Does anybody know what this is? This was last year. All right, this is the lava flow that started out in Puna, and this area is called Kapoho. Kapoho had lots of homes that were destroyed. Here you can see the lava flow advancing. What I want you to focus on is this little part right up here, because that was our newest marine life conservation district. All right, it was called Kapoho Tide Pools. Oh, I'm sorry. It was called Kapoho Tide Pools. It was an amazing MLCD. In fact, I would say it was one of the jewels, because it's very rare to have a tide pool system where you had intact 200, 300-year-old corals in the tide pools. Big, huge, massive corals that looked, oh, this is that lava flow, and in about 4 hours it basically destroyed our entire MLCD. And this is what we lost. This is inside the tide pools. That's what it looked like. An amazing system, gone forever. In fact, there were helicopters that were flying over, seeing sea turtles that were boiled alive floating on the surface from that lava flow. Okay, very few things were able to escape that flow. And things in the tide pool couldn't escape. Everything died. Except 2 years ago, right, because of this bleaching event, I had sent one of my coral technicians there, and he'd collected 4 rather rare species out of that tide pool. So as far as we know, the only live things that still exist out of Kapoho tide pools are in our coral arc system at the Coral Nursery from that event. And it shows the value of doing these kind of things. Okay, so what are the lessons we learned? You can see it. This is just the lessons we've learned at the Coral Nursery that we've shared with Maui Ocean Center. We are going to be moving forward. We are expanding right now. We're tripling the size of the nursery. I'm hiring 3 more people. We're going to be moving to produce about 220 modules, including 1 meter modules a year, which is, right now we can produce about 80. We need to be a lot bigger than that. We learned about acclimating corals. We learned about the need to make sure they're 100% covered, how to really focus on biosecurity in our closed systems. As I said, we're planning to expand in all directions because we need more tools. We don't need more research. We don't need more scientific papers. We don't need more grants. We need more tools. We need more physical ways of affecting change. And as I said, this is what we're doing now. This is where we need to go. So let's quickly talk about this really fast. All right? The secondary line of defense. How do we do interventions? Here's some of the things the Australians are doing. They know that if they can have a little over 1,000 colonies of coral in captivity, from that they can collect the spawn. That spawn will produce about 300 million fertilized gametes. From those fertilized gametes, they can get about 273 million larvae. From those, and this is, by the way, this isn't what would occur naturally. This is the best they can do in captivity. From that 273 million larvae, they can produce about 40 million small little recruits. And from those, they estimate about 13 million will survive. So they can produce 13 million coral colonies using 1 mass spawning a year. But, oh, crap. If they trick the corals, so if you took 1,000 corals and you let them spawn normally during their summer, and then I take another 1,000 corals and I trick them into thinking that the fall is the summer, so they spawn in the fall, and then I take another 1,000 corals and I trick them into thinking that the spring is the summer, so they spawn in the spring. Instead of 1 spawning a year, I'll get 3, and I can triple the number of recruits. That's what they're planning to do. Makes sense, but how do you scale it up? Well, you scale it up. Oh, I'm sorry. You scale it up by finding better ways to capture the spawn out on the reefs so you can get even more larvae, and keeping them in large bins so that you don't have the expense of bringing them back to shore. But how do you scale that up? About 20 years ago, actually I think it was longer than that, 30 years ago, the Exxon Valdez, one of the things that resulted from the Exxon Valdez was basically an international ban on the use of single-hulled oil tankers. And there were a lot of them. There's still a lot of them. And you really can't use them anymore. So they're cheap to buy. So you buy up the single-hulled oil tankers and you repurpose them to go collect coral spawn. And then inside the hull of the tanker, you let the coral spawn develop into larvae, and then you move them onto barges and you transplant that on the reef. And if you do that, you can basically transplant 100,000 little coral colonies a day onto the Great Barrier Reef. That's their plan. This is existing technology, guys. Just finding a new way to do it. Let me show you another one. We know that the sun causes a lot of heat on the reef. That heat is what's causing the bleaching. So if you can find a way to change climate directly over your corals, you can minimize not only the effect on the corals, but on everything else that lives on the reef. One way they do that is with biofilms, and that's what you see right up here. The Australians have developed a biofilm. It's basically a mixture of carbonate and an algal substance, which is proprietary, and it creates a very thin film that they can spray onto the reef. So you go out and you spray a reef. And it works. It cuts down the light by about 15%. It cuts down the temperature by about 20%. Wait, you can keep your corals cool at the hottest time of year. The problem is, how do you scale up the spraying? Well, we have here in Hawaii, the Coast Guard has C-130 aircraft. And on the C-130 aircraft, they have this thing that rolls on. It's a giant fuel tank-like thing. It holds oil dispersant. It's used for oil spills. And coming out of the back of that are these two long pipes, kind of like what you see in a farm to spray insecticide. They use it to spray oil dispersant over large areas of ocean to disperse oil spills. The technology's there. Instead of oil dispersant, they load in the biofilm. The Australian Navy flies their C-130 low over the reef. They can cover a large area reef. Once again, new ways to use existing technology to solve climate change problems. Sea temperature modification. So this is that biofilm right here. And here you can see where it's not. Here you can see where it is. You can still see through the water, but that opaqueness is enough to cut it down. What about creating clouds? Cloud seeding. Well, with climate change, one of the things we know is going to happen is there's going to be a lot less snow in places. So a lot of ski resorts are going to go out of business. One of the things a lot of ski resorts have are snowmaking machines. Snowmaking machines take water and under high pressure through a specialized nozzle, shoot it 1,000 feet horizontally to create snow. So if you buy up all these snowmaking machines, which you should be able to get really cheap through going out of business sales, you modify the nozzles. So now instead of spraying regular water, you're going to spray seawater. Seawater from the immediate region, so you're not affecting the chemical ecology at all. But the nozzles are modified so that as you spray it, as you miss this stuff out, you're mostly spraying salt crystals. Now you spray, instead of spraying it horizontally down, you spray it up into the atmosphere above warm reefs. Warm reefs evaporate seawater, so you got all this moisture up in the air. That moisture is looking for something to cling to, and bingo, you have all these salt crystals in the air. The moisture clings to the salt crystals, and that forms clouds. And clouds are opaque, which means sunlight doesn't go through them. It's called the albedo effect. That cools whatever's underneath. This is another way that they're going to do it. Once again, existing technology. So how about here in Hawaii? By the way, we can do that. And we're actually in discussions to create a memorandum of agreement between DLNR and the Australian Institute of Marine Science to help co-develop some things so that we can try to gain from what they're doing and they can gain from what we're doing. So here's what's likely to happen in Hawaii, because we have really big corals and a bunch of them are going to die. All right, that's fact. That's what we saw today out at Oluwalu. And what do you do with a big dead coral? Because that big dead coral took hundreds and hundreds of years to get to this size, and I can go plant all the 1 meter corals I want. They're still going to take hundreds of years to get that big. And I have all these big dead corals. Well, what if we look at the good people who make saran wrap? And we basically take the same approach you use for wrapping food to wrapping dead corals. But instead of saran wrap, we use a biofilm. The same sort of stuff in a hospital when you have a major burn, they put this film on you. The film helps protect your internal tissues and protect them against air, bacteria, etc. It's a gel. Except in that gel, what if we embed coral tissue? The same way we're doing on the modules, but at a bigger scale. And now I have sheets of this stuff, and I can go to a big dead coral, and I can start to lay these sheets on it. The sheets will kill the underlying algae that's growing on the coral. We can also embed into the biofilm nutrients and minerals that will help the corals to fuse together. And as they fuse together, I'll have a solid layer of coral that's now on top of a big dead coral. So on this thing, we could lay it with biofilm, and in a period of time, maybe a month, 2 months, we'll have an intact, large coral again. All right? This is one place we could go. Let's throw one more idea, and then I promise I'm going to stop because she's giving me a signal. Years ago, on the Big Island, Hawaii was the first place to develop what's called Otec, Ocean Thermal Energy Conversion. It was developed to produce electricity. And the idea was basically, if you pulled in deep cold water in an upwelling area, you brought that deep cold water up to the surface and you put it into a heat diffuser system, you could use a gas to power a turbine, then use the cold water to turn the gas back into a liquid, run it through the system again, and basically you'd have a recycled energy source, and you could power a turbine and generate electricity. That's basically what Otec did. And that worked great, except now if you go to NELH, the Natural Energy Lab on Hawaii, Otec's still there. They're using it to do their electricity and their air conditioning stuff, but mostly what they're making their money off of is they realized when they pulled up this deep cold water, it was full of nutrients, and they're using that to grow things. And that's turned out to be much better. But what if we go back to that original concept? All right, and what if we took barges, because we live on an island. Island reefs are very steep. It's not like continental reefs where you go out 12 miles and it's shallow. You don't have to go out that far from here and you're in really deep water. So we could have a barge near the shore with a pipe going off it that's in deep water, pulling up cold deep water, and then we could have another hose or pipe going onto the reef, pulling in that shallow, very warm water from the reef. And then all we have to do is create a heat diffuser on the barge. So we run the cold water next to the hot water, it will cool down the hot water. We now have cool reef water. But instead of just shooting it back onto the reef, what if we learn from what the Australians are doing and we shoot it up in the air over the reef? So now we have this cool mist over the reef. It's not clouds, but it's a mist. That mist will help diffuse sunlight going in, so we cut down on UV. And the cool mist, as it filters down onto the water, will cool the water. And because it's the same water that was on the reef, there's no chemical ecology effects. And we can cool down our reefs at the hottest times of the year when they're most likely to bleach. And the advantage to this is we can take these barges, because for us, we're looking at something around August, September being our hottest times, probably September. Well, a couple months later, we can ship them down to the South Pacific, to our neighbors, our other Pacific Island nations, and they can use the same technology to cool their reefs because they also have islands. This is doable. We just need the political will, and we need a way of doing it. So one of the things that DLNR we're starting to explore is, where do we do it? This is a Nui Nui Fisheries Research Center on Oahu, across from downtown Honolulu, out on Sand Island. This is where the Coral Nursery is, the Coral Restoration Nursery. There's this plot of land right next to us, which for the last 20, 30 years has been used by a cable laying ship to lay Trans-Pacific cable. Their lease runs out in 2 years. And what we're looking at is, we own this land already. We can take it back. It's on a harbor, so that makes it easy to put in an intake and outfall pipes. Large concrete pad is a pre-existing foundation, so it's pretty cheap to build on. And what if we took this and turned it into this? And what this is a multi-agency think tank, not to write papers, not to conduct research, not to write grants. It'll be full of scientists, it'll be full of managers, and it'll be full of engineers. And just like the Australians are doing, you lock them all in a room and you make them produce tools so that we can create and test and refine the tools we need to address climate change in our nearshore areas on a scale of about 1 square kilometer for our reefs here. Test it and scale it up and start using it. And this is a way to do it. So, with that, I'm going to stop. All I'm going to say is these are the ideas. Some of it is real, we're doing it. The Coral Nursery stuff we're doing. Not only are we doing it, Maʻalaea Ocean Center is doing it. And they're doing it very well. They're just starting up. We've been doing it for a couple years. So this isn't rocket science. And what I've shown you, the Australians, they're not developing new technology. They're taking existing off the shelf and finding ways to use it to solve problems. We need to do that. That requires change and political will. So thank you.